What's up, everybody? Welcome to Gamescast, now episode 53, topic 2. I'm Alex, and this is our conversational gaming show, a show that airs every single week, Tuesday and Thursday. Over these summer months, we do them, and we talk about basically anything gaming related. For this topic, I want to talk about Dead Space 4. I want to talk about Dead Space as a franchise, and if we could ever see another sequel to this franchise. And there's a lot there, and I don't think this game is as far gone and wouldn't come out as much as people I think. Dead Space has been a franchise that obviously has been around for a very long time. A game franchise that definitely is one of the best horror game franchises ever made, especially the first two. The first Dead Space, when that first game came out, was such a different kind of horror game that people latched onto, and they sold extremely well, and they did extremely well in terms of critical reception. The first Dead Space was a massive hit, and that obviously prompted Visceral Games to make 2 additional games. Now, Dead Space went through, an interesting thing. Dead Space 2 came out 2011, Dead Space 3 came out. They experimented with online play. I remember when they started to do that back in Dead Space 2, where you could actually play as the Xenomorphs. You could actually do that, and then you could actually play as a survivor and you hunt them down. I mean, what makes Dead Space so special is its horror aspect, but also blending an action adventure, but more of just like an action game with that horror aspect. I think that's really cool, and not a lot of games have managed to do that, managed to actually have the scares and the tone and the presence that Dead Space had. I mean, the first game is terrifying and really puts you in a scary environment, and it continues. Dead Space 2, I think, is an overall better game than Dead Space 1. I think it tells a better story. I think graphically it looks really good. That's obviously the very well-known where you stick the needle through Isaac's eye, so that obviously was something that, a lot of people always remember about that second game. But Dead Space 2 definitely took it up a notch, maybe sacrificed a little bit of the horror aspect. And obviously, I think when you have sequels to horror games, especially if you're trying to build off of them and make them a trilogy or a franchise, they're not always going to be scarier than the next. A lot of them, you just kind of get comfortable in that world. When you pick up the controller to jump into Dead Space 2, you feel like, it's a worthy, successor to the first game. But you're like, this character, the enemies, how scary it can be, and I feel like that's why in Dead Space 2 they went for the more gross aspects. Then Dead Space 3, they did some very interesting things. Now, I never actually even beat Dead Space 3, but Dead Space 3 was obviously the one where it went more for co-op, more for actual being able to play with somebody else, how you would go through different branches, how one person could do something while the other person is doing something else. Very different environments, sacrificed a lot of things. It went for more crafting. You could definitely craft, and you could make your own guns and stuff like that. That's obviously where that game started to really build on that. But in terms of the horror and in terms of how everything went together, Dead Space 3 was by far the least impressive of the 3. I don't think it sold very well at all, and critically, it definitely is the worst looked at, critic score of the 3 games. Now, since then, Visceral Games has gone through quite the change, including not even existing. Visceral Games has closed. They were the one that Amy Hennig was in charge of to make the new Star Wars game. Star Wars, whatever it was supposed to be called, Ragtag, I think was the name given to it. And so they, this is not happening anytime soon. And Visceral Games, the people who originally made Dead Space 1, 2, and 3, would not be behind this. They, like I said, they're gone. It wasn't going to be this way anyway. They were obviously working on a new Star Wars game, EA giving them that kind of, making them basically saying, here's your Star Wars game, we want you to make this game. And I feel like that's a talented studio that was the right fit for a Star Wars game. Amy Hennig was the right fit for that Star Wars game, and obviously a lot of stuff happened with Visceral Games, with that whole thing, with EA. If you read any of the stories about what happened at that studio, it's very sad and very amazing how many things happened to that studio. But in terms of Dead Space 4, I don't think it's gone forever. I think Dead Space is a franchise that can thrive again. We're kind of in this era of rebuilding horror games. If you just look at the most recent example in Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil is a franchise that's been around for a long time. Now, Capcom doesn't have too many big franchises, and Resident Evil is definitely one of them, and you see what they did. And that's what I was saying earlier with if you're trying to build, if you're trying to actually add games, add sequels, it's not going to be as scary. Well, Resident Evil 7 is very, very different because it's not really Resident Evil 7. It's kind of just a complete separate thing, and they really focused on the horror, really focused on that atmosphere, and they did a phenomenal job. I think Resident Evil 7 is the scariest Resident Evil. I think it's one of the more scary games of all time. We see PT, what Hideo Kojima managed to do with that. We see like a Death Stranding even being whatever that game is, but a little bit of a creepy game. But now is the chance. You can make good horror games, and Dead Space is a pioneer in modern games of a horror franchise that definitely started us on this path. I think when I think of the horror game franchise, I do think of Resident Evil. I do think of Dead Space. I think of the game Amnesia, which is a game that sold moderately, but definitely has a lot of aspects of the whole where you can just hide from people, you can't fight them back, much like Outlast, and so. This is the time to do this. This is the time where horror games can thrive, especially all these smaller horror games, all these indie games, trying to basically copy what PT did and make their own PT. This is what we're getting nowadays, and I think that if there's a time for Dead Space, it's definitely in this era. I think that there is a market for a Dead Space 4 to come out again. Obviously, the logistics of it would have to change. EA would have to give it to another studio because Visceral Games is no more. You have to do something with that title. You have to give it to one of your other studios. So whatever Dead Space 4 ends up being, if it happens, is not going to be the same team, the same people that made the first Dead Space. But that doesn't mean it can't be good. Like I said, I feel like there's a spot in the world of gaming for another Dead Space game. People like these action shooter games. I mean, the Dead Space shooter mechanics and the crafting and all that stuff, and even the story, which was pretty darn solid, there's a spot for that. And then you mix in the horror aspect, and it makes Dead Space an extremely interesting and popular idea that could fit right now and can fit in the future. I just don't think this is going to happen for a very, very long time. I wish it would. They have a lot of things I'm sure they're working on at EA, some games that we probably don't even know about, but I feel like this game is something that maybe is in rough development. Maybe they've talked to studios about this, but I would feel like this game should be being made. I feel like it maybe even is being made, but I don't think we're getting this game for several years. But I do think Dead Space 4 will eventually come out. I do think there's a place in gaming for Dead Space 4. So let me know in the comments below, guys. What do you think of Dead Space? Do you think we could get a Dead Space 4, and what would it look like? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Podcast Now. Again, these Gamescast episodes and topics come out every week over the next couple weeks, every Tuesday and Thursday, and then we'll go back to the every other week schedule. So thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you on the next video.